Ajax, PSV, Feyenoord, Celtic, Benfica, huge clubs with massive fan bases, all previous winners of the European Cup. In the late 90s, early 2000s, they found themselves on the outside of Europe's elite, and they weren't alone. A gulf between English, Spanish, Italian, German and French clubs was rapidly widening. They were looking to make the Champions League a closed shop, and these great historical clubs were being left trembling in the wake of the financial power now concentrated in just 5 countries, punished for their geography. They looked around and they saw the writing on the wall. So they began to get together in secret. They began to devise a way to fight back. They hatched a plan to form a breakaway league. It was known as the Atlantic League, and it almost happened. This is the story of a football revolution, why it was necessary and why it failed. The seeds of an idea had been germinating in the minds of some of Dutch football's most powerful people for years. They began to take root in reality in 1999 after a consultation with the top 3 clubs in the Netherlands. The desire for change came from where the yearning for most things in life stems from: money, or a lack thereof. The push to shake up the system was led by Ajax managing director Frank Kales, who saw that the current situation was unsustainable. Domestic TV revenues were crippling some of the continent's biggest clubs simply because they played in smaller countries. Less attractive leagues meant less lucrative deals. Ajax might earn just £1 million in a season. AC Milan could bring in £33 million. Barcelona, £50 million. How could Ajax hope to compete? How could they survive Champions League qualifiers, let alone keep their best players? They knew the answer too well. After all, their 1995 Champions League winning team was almost entirely picked apart by clubs from the Big 5 leagues. To really illustrate the situation, let's take the example of 3 clubs who, on paper, are in the same boat. They each regularly fill their stadium with over 60,000 supporters. They each have a global network of fiercely passionate fans, and they each have won the European Cup or Champions League in the past. They are Barcelona, Manchester United and Celtic. By 2003, it was estimated that, from European and domestic sources, Barcelona would have annual TV revenues of £60 million. Manchester United would be in excess of £35 million. And Celtic, the first British team to win the European Cup, a club whose attendances would rival any of the top 6 in the Premier League, just £4 million. This was not the only problem. Many teams from Scotland, Belgium, the Netherlands and Portugal had outgrown their own leagues. Celtic and Rangers, and electing Club Bruges, Ajax, PSV and Feyenoord, Porto, Benfica and Sporting. These handful of clubs regularly traded domestic titles between themselves, and the rest never stood a chance of catching up. These leagues had become predictable, lacked jeopardy, and were laughably uncompetitive. Kales knew the solution and was ready to fight to bring it to light. We must move beyond country borders. If the authorities still say no, then the only other option is to go into conflict mode. Celtic were immediately brought on board, and Chief Executive Alan MacDonald gave the plan his full backing. The club's multimedia manager David Heath reiterated the drastic need for something new. Great names such as Ajax, Anderlecht, Benfica and Celtic are being reduced to occasional players on a European stage dominated by the Big 5 leagues of England, Italy, Germany, France and Spain. These clubs are no longer able to generate the income required to compete. Rangers owner David Murray was initially reluctant to be linked with the idea. However, as we rolled into the new millennium and interested parties met in Amsterdam in January to discuss moving the plans forward, Murray quickly changed his tune. I'm changing my opinion. We are now hindering Scottish football. Perhaps it will be better for the other clubs not to strain themselves trying to keep up with Rangers and Celtic. After that meeting, things began to gather steam quickly. As PSV chairman Harry van Rij said, "I'm not a prophet, but I am a realist. To survive economically and to realise our sporting ambitions, PSV need to play at a higher level on a weekly basis. We're having talks with clubs from other countries, and I am convinced it will happen. I think that within 6 months a deal will be done. We have to do this in order not to disappear from the bigger picture in Europe. In August 2000, Scotland's leading non-Old Firm clubs gave the project their blessing. Scotland manager Craig Brown was willing to accept that Celtic and Rangers moving on could be a good thing. There is an argument that the SPL will be a better competition in terms of those other clubs having a chance of winning. And then, just as momentum seemed unstoppable, UEFA stepped in. They reminded everyone who was really in charge. Only they could sanction European competitions, and any club breaking away would be punished. However, those spearheading the movement had always anticipated pushback and were not going to back down at the first sign of trouble. In February 2001, it was announced that 13 clubs from Holland, Scotland, Portugal, Belgium, Denmark and Sweden had signed a proposal to break away from their domestic leagues and form an Atlantic League, which would start in July 2002. They were unhappy that UEFA had completely and consistently dismissed their very legitimate concerns. PSV chairman Peter Fossen was set to meet with UEFA official Lars Christer Olsen in Neom, Switzerland. We need a change of mindset from UEFA. For us, it is a matter of survival. We talk, they listen, and nothing happens. We want two-way dialogue. We do not want war. In war, you get casualties, but that depends on UEFA. My bet is we will get a split. Well, it's a good thing he did not gamble the farm on that prediction. UEFA reiterated their position, threatened to expel any rebel clubs, and looked to placate them with the promise to revise the format of the UEFA Cup. The Atlantic dream lay in tatters, but what if it hadn't? What would this league, this rebellion, actually have looked like? The worst possible iteration of the idea had the 16 clubs completely abandoned their respective leagues and set up an MLS-style franchise from which none of the founding teams could ever be relegated. Obviously, this would fly in the face of the meritocracy football is meant to be, and is the exact reason the 2021 Super League plan was met with such fury. Thankfully, the founding members didn't really seem to have this kind of scheme in mind. One plan would see the breakaway clubs compensate those they had left behind. Celtic and Rangers were apparently ready to pay £50 million a year to the SPL to ensure their involvement in the Atlantic League. Another quirkier suggestion was that the domestic leagues would act as a feeder system for Atlantic League clubs who would field the development sides in the old competitions. Next, a system with relegation appeared to be most likely. The worst 3 or 4 Atlantic League clubs, for example, would be replaced by the top-tier champions from their respective nations. The Atlantic League would have a potential television audience of 50 million viewers, and estimates suggested it would be worth £250 million annually within 5 years. Ideally, the clubs from the Atlantic League would be granted entry into the Champions League, alongside champions from the domestic leagues. In any of these scenarios, how those domestic leagues, now deprived of their biggest commercial draws, would get on in their absence is a matter of purely hypothetical debate. The most optimistic outlook would see these competitions thrive. Now closer, more competitive, and more exciting. Stadiums would be full as fans flocked back to cheer on their teams, who now had a real chance of becoming champions every year. No longer forced to spend beyond their means to compete, more modest TV revenues could theoretically be enough to sustain them as long as the supporters kept on coming. The doom and gloom scenario would see these leagues fade into irrelevance. Unable to capture the imagination or attract good players, they would slowly wither and die. And yet, for all the excitement, every version of the Atlantic League faced the same brutal reality. It had to solve a business problem without breaking the soul of the sport, and it had to do so with UEFA watching its every move. Although the initial idea had been scuppered, the proposal was far from dead. The numbers did not lie, and the doomsday scenarios warned of by Kales, Van Rij, McDonald and Fossen were edging closer to reality. In 2002, Celtic and Rangers saw their future outside the SPL and made a concerted effort to join the English footballing pyramid. They were rebuffed. In August of that same year, Dutch and Belgian officials held a secret presentation with interested clubs in Monaco. The Atlantic League was top of their agenda. A North Atlantic League Cup was also discussed. This would be a knockout tournament held during a winter break between the clubs sitting in the top 4 positions of the league tables in Scotland, Belgium, the Netherlands and Denmark. Standard Liège were the driving force behind the plan, which was seen as a potential stepping stone towards a breakaway league. Celtic were willing. UEFA weren't completely against it. The most important thing is that the national associations must reach an understanding. but international competitions must be played under the auspices of UEFA. We would then have to see the format, though at the moment our priority is analysing the future of the UEFA Cup after restructuring the Champions League, said a UEFA spokesman. In the end, there were too many complications and not enough enthusiasm, and this did not get off the ground. Then, for 6 years, everything went quiet. Now and again, the papers would invoke the Atlantic League like a mythical creature, long rumoured, never seen. But things were just simmering under the surface, and in 2008, they all boiled over again. Rangers manager Walter Smith resurrected calls for an Atlantic League with a gloomy assessment. I take the opposite view to a lot of people. If we don't do something, Scottish football is in danger of dying. The Atlantic League would seem to be a natural progression. I don't think there is any doubt that at some stage in the future it will happen. It is just how it will happen that is up for debate. In the bigger leagues, there is not any real need for teams to leave the league they are in. They have an ability to finance and keep the clubs at a higher level. The problems that are developing are that the bigger clubs in smaller countries are having a major struggle to keep up. Celtic chief executive Peter Lawwell tentatively agreed with his Rangers counterpart Martin Bain that the old firm needed a bigger platform. Michael van Praag, president of the Dutch FA, planned to lobby UEFA regarding the revival of Atlantic League proposals. There were positive noises from across the continent. PSV's media chief Pedro Salazar Hewitt said, "We will always be open to creating a new situation, and we know UEFA is aware of this problem. Any talks would be welcomed by us. The Atlantic League would be a formula we would be delighted to be involved in and interested in joining," added Anderlecht's communication manager David Stegen. The Brøndby sports manager Anders Bjerregaard said, "We are positive about new actions, and we will listen to what the concept is about." AIK Stockholm sporting director Bjorn Westrom said, "We would not rule it out." However, the same old issues hadn't gone away, most notably the potential for fixture clashes in an already packed schedule. If you are qualifying for the Champions League group stage, then when can you fit in an Atlantic League? It is not really an option for us, said FC Copenhagen secretary Charles Maskelin. Supporters also raised serious concerns about travel costs, logistics, and the risk of losing connection with their club. The main reason the 2008 plan came to nothing was that UEFA's stance had not changed. They were unwilling to entertain any breakaway league in case it opened the floodgates. If there was an Atlantic League, what was to stop a Balkan League springing up, for example? And most dreaded of all, the original Super League. UEFA had already halted the so-called G14, Europe's biggest clubs, from breaking away in 1998 with heavy threats and the promise to change the Champions League format, which they did. But the fear that they might try to break away again never truly disappeared. It was 8 years before the Atlantic League resurfaced, this time from an unlikely source. In 2016, it was FC Copenhagen, a club that had been one of the more hesitant voices in 2008, now leading the charge. Their director, Anders Horsholt, revealed that discussions had been ongoing to set up a European league involving clubs from Scotland, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway and Sweden. Celtic's Peter Lawwell began working to secure the backing of Ajax, hoping to rally support from other clubs outside Europe's top 5 leagues. Danish sources suggested the proposals would involve 12 to 16 teams, drawn from 6 countries. Yes, it's true. If we don't act now, we will see the biggest clubs grow larger and stronger, while it will be increasingly difficult for clubs like us. This is not a situation that we have created, but we have to deal with it, because we cannot live with the alternative accounting, said Horsholt. But this time, it was one of the original instigators who seemed to be pulling back. We have discussed a number of plans with our foreign colleagues. Currently, we are not in negotiations for our new league, said Tun Gerbrand's PSV CEO, but that wouldn't be the final chapter. 4 years later, the idea would return, more corporate than ever. In 2020, SAL Sports Capital, a sports investment group spearheaded by Shelbourne FC co-owner Andrew Doyle, looked to set up a new Atlantic League, and they had some serious weight behind them. Private equity firms had underwritten the media rights for €1 billion. JP Morgan had advised the scheme. Despite the money involved, this iteration lacked a lot of gravitas of the initial idea in 2000. Gone were the weight and history of Ajax, PSV, Feyenoord, Porto, Benfica, Sporting and Anderlecht. Instead, it would be a 20-team competition, including clubs from Scotland, Ireland, Sweden, Denmark and Norway. This meant that teams like Aberdeen, Hibs and Hearts would be included. And for once, UEFA wasn't standing in the way. More and more countries are interested in the possibility of a regional league, because that would increase the value of clubs, as well as income from sponsors and the sale of TV rights. UEFA in principle has nothing against regional leagues. The main problem is how to go from those leagues to European competitions. UEFA would have to solve that problem, said Alexander Cheferin. The deal collapsed because this time Dermot Desmond wasn't interested. The desperate need for Celtic to leave Scotland for financial reasons no longer existed. The status quo was suiting him just fine at that point. Something like a British Isles League would have been far more enticing for him. Without a massive club like Celtic, the whole thing fell apart, as Andrew Doyle explained. The position on that is that Celtic have decided not to participate in the proposal. As a consequence, Celtic being a significant brand, it is on pause or dead because of Dermot Desmond or Celtic's opinion of it. He went on to explain how the league would have worked. I think it's obvious that bigger clubs should play at an appropriate level of competition, and what we were trying to do with that proposal was simply trying to create another layer in the pyramid. So Scottish football and Irish, Norwegian, Danish, Swedish football would benefit because they would be playing at a higher level of competition, but nevertheless remaining in their own countries. The players would play for their own clubs at a higher level of competition with completely open access from the SPFL to this league. So explicitly, the SPFL becomes more competitive because it's no longer a league that only two clubs can win. Then this higher tier in the pyramid creates new additional financial value, which can then be poured into the Scottish game through solidarity payments. And just like that, the final push collapsed. Not because UEFA crushed it, not because fans revolted, but because the appetite from the biggest players simply wasn't there anymore. This version of the Atlantic League may have had serious money behind it, but it lacked soul. The big names were gone. The historic European success was gone. What remained was a sleek, investor-led proposal that no longer captured the imagination, and maybe that was the clearest sign yet that the Atlantic League dream was over. But the problems it had been trying to solve, they never went away. Big clubs from smaller countries still struggle to compete in the Champions League. Champions from some smaller nations don't even qualify automatically. They have to fight through punishing qualifying rounds, while also rans from the top 5 leagues are gifted direct entry. Some clubs have adapted. Celtic, for example, have mastered a player trading model. They sit on tens of millions and collect domestic honours like they're going out of fashion, but it comes at a cost. Celtic have been depressingly poor in Europe for years now. When your best players are sold every 2 seasons, how do you build something? How do you compete with clubs who can afford to keep their stars? The answer is you don't. Not sustainably, not meaningfully. The Atlantic League was born out of frustration, but also out of hope. A hope that there might be space in European football for a middle class, that greatness shouldn't be confined to 5 countries. It failed, but its failure wasn't just about money or planning. It was a reflection of something deeper. European football has become a closed conversation, and unless something truly radical changes, clubs like Ajax, Celtic, Anderlecht or Benfica will remain on the outside, looking in. The Atlantic League did not break football, but it did hold up a mirror, and I, personally, still believe in the idea, as long as it's rooted in merit. If the weakest clubs can be relegated and the strongest left behind can rise, then the most essential principle of football survives, that the weak can beat the powerful. If the leagues these clubs leave behind are supported properly, through subsidies, solidarity payments, whatever it takes, history can be preserved, and a healthier, more competitive landscape can be created. Yes, there are logistical issues. Fans need to be able to follow their teams, but these aren't unsolvable problems, just unprioritized ones. But they do need to be solved, because while the new Champions League format may be producing entertaining football, it's doing so at a cost. It is disgustingly exclusive. The top 5 leagues will continue to get richer and richer, and occurrences of teams like Ajax reaching a semi-final will become a thing of the past, a fantasy out of reach. Maybe the product has never been more exciting, but it has never been further away from what football is meant to be.